Hi, everyone. This is Amber Crossan, Communications Staff with Heart and Alliance Research and Policy. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are going to wait just a couple more minutes. We saw some folks who were logging on, and yeah, once everyone gets in, we will get started shortly. Thank you. Hi, everybody. We are going to get started. I'm going to hand it over to Katie Buitrago, our research director, right now. So take it away, Katie.
Thanks, Amber, and thanks to everyone who's joining us today to hear about our latest report on Illinois poverty. We're really excited to share the findings with you. If you've been following our work, we've been releasing the report on poverty in Illinois for almost 20 years now. And in the beginning, we really were looking at trends in the data of trying to understand who lives in poverty, where they live, who's most impacted. And we started thinking about that during the economic boom in the 90s, where the narrative was really that a rising tide lifted all boats because there was this big economic boom happening. But as a service provider, we saw that that wasn't true with the participants walking through our doors. So we really wanted to dispel some narratives about poverty trends, and this is how a series of reports was born. In recent years, we've been looking at how poverty intersects with other key issues in our society. We've looked at how structural racism influences poverty experiences. We looked at the cycle of poverty, trauma, and violence. And this year, we're looking at gender and poverty. And why are we looking at that now? In some ways, women today are achieving parity with men at historic levels. Women are achieving higher levels of education than men are. Congress has record numbers of women legislators, and Chicago just elected its first Black woman mayor, the largest American city to do so. But against this backdrop of progress, women and gender minorities still experience profound and persistent disparities in poverty and well-being. With women taking unprecedented leadership in government, business, and other sectors, we're at a unique moment in time to tackle the root causes of issues that continue to keep women and gender minorities at a persistent disadvantage. And here's just some housekeeping items about the webinar. We'll take questions at the end, and you can use the question chat box to send a question. And we will make the video and slides available on our website after the webinar, and we'll email that out to you. And you can tweet along with us with the hashtag #GenderDisadvantage to share your thoughts about the webinar. So first, I wanted to give an overview of poverty numbers in Illinois. Poverty is going down in Illinois since the peak during the recession, but our poverty rate was statistically the same as last year's. And unlike the rest of the U.S., Illinois hasn't recovered from the recession. We have not returned to pre-recession levels of poverty. And it's still about 1 in 8 Illinoisans live in poverty. Looking at how we compare to other states, our poverty rate is 12.6%, and 20 states have poverty rates that are lower than Illinois. Looking at income, the median household income in Illinois increased from last year, but it still remains pre-recession levels. Right now, it's about $63,000 a year. Our pre-recession level of income was about $65,000 a year. And digging into gender poverty, poverty rates for women in Illinois are 14%, which is higher than the state average, as well as men's poverty rates. Black people and Latinas have the highest poverty rates when you break it down by gender and race, ranging from 2 to 3 times higher than white men's poverty rates. And in 2015, 1 in 5 trans Illinoisans lived in poverty, compared to 13.6% of Illinoisans overall. More than 1 in 4 LGBTQ Illinoisans earn less than $24,000 a year, compared to less than 1 in 5 non-LGBT Illinoisans. And so we're talking a lot about, who lives in poverty and at what rates, but what does that actually mean? What's the experience of living in poverty? Well, that means living on less than $19,500 if you're a family of 3. And that's the same throughout the state, whether you live in Chicago or Cairo, whether you live in New York or Nebraska. These poverty rates don't change throughout the country. They don't take into account local costs of living. So when you're living in a high cost of living area like Chicago, we're talking about high levels of deprivation and need here. And these levels often dictate things like eligibility for public benefits. And it's estimated that you need almost $70,000 a year to support a family of 3 in Cook County, thinking about all the costs of living, which is more than 3 times this poverty rate. So there's flaws with the poverty rate, and the figures that we're talking about of people living in poverty is displaying a high level of need. So looking deeper into gender poverty issues, female-headed households have much higher poverty rates than male-headed households or married couple families. And so these households headed by single women, their poverty rates are 26%, and that's twice the rate for households headed by single men. Women-headed households with children have the highest food insecurity rates in the United States. 1 in 3 women-headed households with children are food insecure, compared to 1 in 6 households with children overall. And female-headed households are more likely than other household types to pay more than half of their income towards rent in Illinois. Nearly half of families headed by Black women pay more than half of their income in rent, compared to 1/3 of Latina-headed households and 28% of white female-headed households. And poverty just looks at disparities in income and whether you're above or below the poverty line, but there's many different ways of looking at economic well-being that paint a fuller picture. So we want to talk about some of those too. Looking at the income gap in Illinois, women still earn 78 cents on the dollar compared to men for full-time year-round work, and this gap hasn't budged since 2011. When you look for every dollar earned by white men, Latina women earn 50 cents, Black women earn 63 cents, and white women earn 76 cents. So this disparity is even deeper when you break it down by gender and race. And looking at wealth, so thinking about the assets that you have, your house, your car, your savings, really things that you can rely upon in case of an emergency. The disparities are even more stark than the income gap. For every dollar of wealth owned by white men, Latina women have essentially 0 cents. It rounds down to 0. Black women have 1 cent, and white women have 54 cents of wealth. And this is looking at single people, since looking at couples, their wealth is often commingled. And the gender wage gap, if we do nothing to change these trends, the gender wage gap in Illinois is projected to close in 2065. So we're a long way out. And ending the gender wage gap would have huge economic effects on Illinois, in addition to equity impacts. Poverty rates for working women would be halved. That would translate into a 16% increase in women's earnings, totaling over $20 billion going into the Illinois economy. And 1.1 million children would benefit from equal pay, reducing the poverty rate for children with working mothers by 43%. In this report this year, we really wanted to include the voices of women who lived sort of these intersecting experiences of poverty and other types of oppression. And so we're excited to share some of those stories with you today. And we've used pseudonyms for most of these women to protect their privacy. So we have one Heartland employee, Zelda, is a woman of color who's experienced job discrimination from her previous employers, witnessed her mother and father work long hours to try to make ends meet, and much more. She grew up in subsidized housing with her parents working hard, and she wishes she had a place where she could talk about her stress, but she felt like that was discouraged in her community. And I'll pause for a minute and let you read this quote from her discussing her childhood. So as you can see from the story, Zelda felt like people had low expectations of her because she was a Black woman, and she wasn't encouraged to build a better life. And this really illustrates how racial poverty disparities can stretch across generations. When your parents have less, they can pass on less wealth to you in the future. It also shows how, many people who live in poverty work, and they work hard, and they still struggle to make ends meet. And one theme that we saw throughout this report is this idea of compounding oppression. Gender discrimination on its own results in troubling economic disparities, but systemic discrimination on many domains, misogyny, racism, xenophobia, homophobia, mass incarceration, deepens those inequities. And so we presented snapshots throughout the report of different subpopulations of women of color, from LGBTQ women, gender nonconforming people, to immigrant women, women in prison, to show how poverty negatively affects their lives. And as you're hearing this data and thinking about this issue, we urge you to really consider, as people have experienced more than one of these identities, systemic economic barriers get even steeper. So thinking about, the systemic barriers in place for all of these groups can really compound the experience of trying to make it out of poverty. And this is the classic definition of intersectionality. It's like ratcheting up the difficulty in a video game. It's still possible to win the game, but you're playing it in a much more difficult mode. And so looking at some of the statistics that illustrate this experience of compounding oppression, as we saw earlier, women of color fare worse than both white women and men on measures of income and poverty. One theme we saw with this report was that women, and gender minorities experience even deeper disparities with other historically oppressed identities. The low-wage workforce in the U.S. is predominantly made up of women, especially women of color. 2/3 of low-wage workers are women, and half of low-wage workers are women of color. And non-citizen women in Illinois have higher poverty rates, over 1 in 5, than native-born women and all men in Illinois. And women are more likely to end up in prison for crimes driven by economic need. Indeed, their incomes prior to incarceration in the U.S. are lower than men's incomes, and Black and Latina women have lower incomes before entering prison than white women do. And women are also more likely to experience intimate partner violence over the course of their lifetime than men. So looking at another story, Delilah is a participant in Heartland Alliance's asset building program, which supports individuals working towards financial stability. She experienced the difficulties of trying to create a new life for herself when she arrived to the United States at 18 years old. Her undocumented status made her feel dependent on the family she worked for, and she also felt like people tried to take advantage of her as a woman who didn't have documentation or financial independence. But she managed to save money for an education over 4 or 5 years and is now working to get a green card. And I'll pause for a minute and let you read her story. Delilah's story really shows how the barriers of poverty and undocumented status can make a woman vulnerable to exploitation. The majority of people identified as being trafficked in Illinois are women. Human traffickers can take advantage of women in poverty to gain control over them by using economic manipulation. And women veterans, young women, and women with substance use and mental health issues can be at increased risk for homelessness. And women experiencing poverty and women of color have poorer health than high-income women and white women. Some of the ways we see that is that Black women in Illinois have much higher rates of HIV than other racial groups, as well as higher rates of death in childbirth and higher teen birth rates. Tony is a participant with Heartland Alliance's Freedom from Trafficking program. Since she immigrated to the United States, she faced homelessness, human trafficking, and mental health issues. She first encountered her trafficker when she was living in a homeless shelter. She came to the U.S. on a sports scholarship, got injured, and then lost her scholarship and became homeless. She continued going to college while living in the shelter. Her trafficker was a volunteer at the shelter who moved her out of the city, where she was no longer able to get medication for her mental illness. And that made it even harder for her to escape her situation. Since then, she's been able to leave her trafficking situation and get stable housing, Medicare, and public benefits, working with our Freedom from Trafficking program. And I'll pause for a minute and let you read some of her story. So Tony's story shows how traffickers can take advantage of poverty, mental illness, and homelessness in order to gain control over women. And going back to Zelda's story, in addition to what we heard earlier, Zelda experienced sexual violence and as a child and intimate partner violence as an adult. She did not have therapy available to her when she was abused as a child, and it was looked down upon in her community. Her longtime partner abused her in adulthood for 14 years, but she and her children were financially dependent upon him, which made it hard to leave. He wouldn't let Zelda work, and even during times that she could, she often had to call off sick due to the injuries she sustained through this intimate partner violence. And I'll let you read more of her story for a second. Zelda's story really shows us how trauma in childhood can put women at risk of experiencing violence in adulthood, and also how intimate partner violence can make it hard to move out of poverty for psychological as well as material reasons. It shows how abusers can use economic manipulation to control women, and how intergenerational racism can translate into intergenerational poverty. One key theme we kept seeing throughout this report is that labor inequities are really the root cause of other disparities. Women face disparities in job quality, pay, workplace harassment and discrimination, and unpaid labor. And even though women have better education outcomes and lower unemployment rates than men, they're still more likely to live in poverty, raising concerns about their job quality. Over half of U.S. women report experiencing some sort of behavioral mistreatment in the workplace. And trans people also report extremely high rates of workplace discrimination. Few people report this workplace harassment because retaliation rates are extremely high against people who report. And even controlling for measurable qualifications, women still earn less than men. There are also disparities in unpaid labor in addition to the paid labor force. Women spend 1.6 times more time on household activities than men do, and 1.9 times more time on caring for household members than men do. And while this unpaid labor is crucially important on a societal and family level, it's often not compensated, and it makes it harder for women to engage in the labor force, pursue educational opportunities, and engage in public life. It also means that caregivers don't get the important benefits that come with work, such as paid time off, retirement savings, access to the earned income tax credit, and other benefits that are dependent on your employment status, and more. Since we were focusing on gender and poverty and not just women in poverty, we really wanted to look at how gender poverty exists outside of the gender binary. And this is hard to study, unfortunately, because there's limited data at the local level on transgender and gender minorities, individuals living in Illinois. But there are a few good data sources out there that give us a sense of the economic experience for this population. In general, LGBT women and gender nonconforming people have worse economic outcomes. As we saw before, LGBT Illinoisans have higher unemployment rates and lower incomes than non-LGBT Illinoisans, and 1 in 5 trans Illinoisans live in poverty, and 1 in 10 are unemployed. Both of these rates are higher than for cisgender Illinoisans. Extraordinarily high rates of LGBT people report experiencing harassment or discrimination, much of it in the workplace. 15% of transgender people lost a job because of their gender identity or expression, and 28% in Illinois were fired, denied a promotion, or were not hired. 28% of trans people in Illinois experienced homelessness at some point in their lives because of their gender identity, and 21% experienced housing discrimination just in the past year. Eva is a trans, queer, femme participant at Town Hall, which is Chicago's first LGBTQ-friendly senior housing development opened by Heartland Alliance and Center on Halsted. When she made the decision to transition in 2009, she struggled to find proper health care and safe housing. She lived at first in an unsafe housing situation where she felt threatened by other residents. She even opted to take the stairs to her 5th floor apartment because she was scared of being trapped in the elevator with other residents. And with safe housing now, she feels like she can live with dignity even though she lives in poverty. And I'll let you read her story for a minute. So hearing all these statistics can be overwhelming and depressing, and feels like, we're in this morass with nowhere to go. But I think there's a lot of good ideas and great momentum around policy solutions that can help reduce these gender inequities. The forces that result in these gender inequities have been in effect for generations and are woven deeply throughout our policymaking, private business practice, and personal attitudes and behaviors. Far-reaching systemic change, in addition to incremental victories, are needed to eliminate disparities for women and gender minorities. So some of the solutions that we highlight in this report include addressing discrimination head-on to increase opportunity and fairness. And that one way to do that is strengthening protections against retaliation for workplace harassment claims and increased penalties for employers. Another solution is to increase people's income to foster economic security and strength. Well, there's a bill that's currently under consideration at the Illinois level right now that would prohibit employers from asking a prospective employee's pay history, which would reduce inequity, perpetuating inequity across jobs. We also need to modernize and expand the earned income tax credit to expand participation in the labor market for single mothers and provide important cash assistance to people providing valuable but not traditionally compensated labor, who are largely women. We should broaden eligibility for the EITC up the income chain, as well as include low-income caregivers and students, increase the amount to address the rising cost of living, and deliver payments periodically throughout the year instead of in one large lump sum. We also need to increase wealth building opportunities to address that huge wealth gap that we saw at the beginning. Increasing pathways and income for women would allow them to save more for retirement and reduce poverty rates for older women. As well, we should offer matched emergency savings plans at workplaces. We need to change the structure of work in order to foster stability and success. Some ways to do that include requiring minimum paid sick time for workers statewide, even though we have that in Chicago. We need it throughout the state as well. Require fair scheduling by employers so employees can plan their other life responsibilities such as childcare, second jobs, or education. We need to improve family and medical leave policy to better support the caregiving responsibilities for all Illinoisans. We need to recognize and value the vital role of caregiving for families in our economy. We need to expand the availability of subsidized childcare as well as the Child Independent Care Tax Credit. And we need to position care work as a social and collective responsibility rather than an individual one. We shouldn't exclude people from social programs on the basis of their paid employment status, and we need to ensure an adequate standard of living for unpaid caregivers, as well as support men's ability to provide caregiving to reduce the gap in unpaid labor. We need to ensure healthcare access, meaningful coverage, and support. One crucial way of doing this is expanding and protecting Medicaid, which is a hugely important program for protecting women's health. Over 760,000 women in Illinois have public health insurance coverage. Medicaid helps women meet crucial medical needs, covering nearly half of all births in the United States and 3/4 of publicly funded family planning services. We need to defend women's reproductive rights, as well as ensure that pre-existing condition protections and maternity benefits are provided in the individual insurance market. We need to support the health needs of trans people. While it's illegal in Illinois to deny health insurance to people on the basis of gender identity, many insurance providers do not cover treatment related to gender transition. And until very recently, just since this report came out a month ago, Illinois expanded Medicaid coverage for trans and gender nonconforming people. Previously, transition-related Medicaid coverage was prohibited in Illinois, but now we can cover these surgeries and other procedures. So this is a huge victory for these affirming procedures for transgender people. We need to provide meaningful responsive supports for lower income women to build upon. So we need to strengthen the temporary assistance to needy families and increase the amount that's offered in Illinois. We need to tailor SNAP outreach to increase food insecurity, which would particularly benefit groups of women who are currently under-enrolled but who desperately need SNAP, including women in college, elderly women, immigrant women, women experiencing homelessness, and women exiting prison. We need to increase the special supplemental nutrition program for women, infants, and children to increase program retention and uptake. And we need to increase resources for affordable housing to significantly improve the financial stability of the 37% single female-headed households in Illinois who pay more than half of their income towards rent. We need to prevent and respond to violence to create a culture of safety and well-being. That means strengthening and growing trauma-informed mental health and violence prevention programs. We need to support flexible and responsive intimate partner violence services. That includes support for childcare, credit and asset building, housing, education, food, employment, and cash assistance. And we need to allocate funding for services specifically for survivors of human trafficking, which Illinois is somewhat unique in not having specific funding sources for survivors of trafficking. We need to enhance protections for immigrant women and survivors of trafficking by boosting protections against wage theft. Immigrants are particularly at risk of wage theft. We need to increase oversight and regulation of fields that have higher incidences of workplace violations and labor trafficking. And we need to support pathways to citizenship, including support for equal access to justice, legal services, protection, and support for immigrants. Finally, we need to address the cycle of hardship that's perpetuated by justice system involvement. And we're fighting hard in several bills in Springfield right now that address these very issues. We need to remove barriers to employment for people with criminal records, which would help women with records reintegrate into their communities, find and maintain employment, and increase their housing stability. We need to remove the collateral consequences laws that pose barriers to housing, education, and training for people with criminal records. Finally, we need to reform the criminal justice system to ensure fair and equal law enforcement, eliminate mandatory minimum sentences, advance comprehensive sentencing reforms, and eliminate solitary confinement. And so that is all I have for you. I thank you so much for your attention. But we're now going to open it up for questions. So please enter your questions in the chat box. So first question is, when people apply for jobs, do they usually indicate their sexual orientations? Just wondering how data was collected showing the LGBTQ population were disadvantaged. So most of this is, we did a big review of the literature looking at workplace discrimination for LGBTQ people, and it had many different methods and data sources. Some of it was more qualitative, doing interviews with people in this population. Some of it was surveys of these groups. The data about the trans individuals in Illinois was from a big survey. Because it's hard, we don't collect information on that, like in our census or things like that. So a lot of it is self-reported, but it does compare, self-reported rates of harassment and discrimination against, people who are not in these sexual and gender minorities. And so people might be hired, based on their identity, but they might experience harassment once they get to the workplace, or if their gender presentation might work against them in the hiring process when, face-to-face and interviews and things like that. Another question is, will there be more in-depth data on poverty in Illinois communities available? Yes, we are working on analyzing data at the community level in Illinois, and then we're going to release that in a couple months. We're going to have a cool website where you can look up a lot of these indicators that we talked about today at your community level, at the city level, and at the Chicago community area level. So keep an eye out for that and sign up for our mailing list if you want to learn more. Another question is, why did you include LGBTQ people and gender nonconforming people in this report? So we wanted to look broadly at experiences of gender and poverty. And a lot of the gender disparities that you see are with women. However, I think people are becoming increasingly aware, although not aware enough, about the experiences of gender nonconforming people and LGBTQ people. So we wanted to make sure we looked at the full gender spectrum and not just the gender binary. Any more questions? If you'd like to access the full report, someone asked how we can do that. You can go to heartlandalliance.org/poverty report. And we're also, when we send the email afterwards, we can send a link to that. And someone asked if we're available to do presentations on this in person. Absolutely. If you'd like to get in touch, you can send me an email at kbuitrago, B as in boy, UITRAGO @heartlandalliance.org. And we can set up a time to come out and talk to your community or your staff about these issues. And we can also share my contact information in our follow-up email. Any other questions? It doesn't look like we have more questions coming in. So I just want to thank you all for your time and your attention. If you think of something later, feel free to get in touch. And I'm happy to answer that. So that is all. Thank you.